Okay, people will continue to let people trickle into the webinar, but we have a lot of information to get through, so I'm going to just get started here. Thank you all for joining us. Greatly appreciate it. My name is Aileen Burke, and I am the Director for the Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Portfolio here at Alberta Council. I lead the Nonprofit Government Relations program here. So today we're going to look at a high-level overview of Budget 2025 impacts on the nonprofit sector. It's a lot of information. If time allows, this is kind of our agenda. We're going to look at 9 specific ministries, do a kind of a contextual highlight to let you know what we're looking at, and then we'll look at trends and projections for things to watch out for in the coming months. So the theme of this budget is meeting the challenge. Of course, we are all very much aware of the uncertainty that we face right now with tariffs and fluctuating revenues and a new tax bracket and all that fun stuff. And so Minister Horner's statement is that we're meeting the challenge with this budget. Says Alberta has never hesitated to rise to any challenge, to fight for what's fair, or fight against whoever might threaten our quality of life. It's that kind of sets a tone for the budget for this year. For our high-level overview, we've got a ton of information to get through in a short period of time. So, as our esteemed minister said during the budget address, buckle up. It's going to be a lot. My colleague Zach covered a lot of the nitty-gritty about the overarching financial picture on Friday, I believe it was. So I'm just going to skim through a bunch of the strategic plan and the fiscal plan highlights, and then we'll focus more on the ministerial breakdown and the potential impacts for the sector specifically. So in terms of the strategic plan priorities, we've got 2: maintaining Alberta's advantage and then supporting Albertans. And then for the fiscal plan highlights, we're just going to set kind of the economic context, look at some notable changes, and then look at commitments, funding commitments that were made that kind of fall outside of the 9 ministries we're going to look at. So for the strategic plan, there's 6 main objectives under priority number 1, which is the maintaining Alberta's advantage. Those include diversifying the economy, making sure it's built on strong business-friendly policies that continue to attract job-creating investment. You will notice a lot of overlap in this budget with Budget 2024 terminology. So just keep that in mind if some of this sounds familiar, because there's a lot of repeat. Alberta is also looking at implementing, under this first objective there, implementing our Alberta's Care First automobile insurance model. That's their title for it. That will be coming out anticipated this spring. So we'll see how that all rolls out. Connecting Albertans to jobs. So that's just supporting the workforce through a responsive training and employment program, attracting talent and creating a labor force to meet the demands of the growing economy. We're looking at developing and implementing ministry-specific job attraction strategies with a focus on raising awareness of opportunities in skilled trades and professions among young Albertans aged 16 to 24, and adults considering career transitions. Now, I know many of you will have seen this commitment in Budget 2024, where there were 4 or 5 ministries that had this under their business ministry plans, but they've recommitted to it this year. So hopefully we'll see some progress in that regard. In terms of strengthening economic activity and attracting investment, I mean, this one's pretty straightforward, but they are allocating $22.5 million to the Alberta Tech and Innovation Strategy. So it's a real big focus still on tech and innovation. They're growing Alberta's film and television industry, and then trying to secure Alberta's position as the go-to destination for film production. And they want to position Alberta as a prime destination for data centers. So I'm sure many of you saw the announcement that the MD of Greenview, in partnership with Kevin O'Leary, has Wonder Valley, I believe it's called, and that'll be one of our first data centers in Alberta. But there are many more in the pipes, apparently. So objective 4 is just standing up for Alberta's natural resources. 5, ensuring the health and integrity of Alberta's environment and ecosystem. Under this one, particularly relevant for nonprofits, it's that they have a commitment that through the drought response plan, the government is going to work collaboratively with municipalities, NPOs, industry, and Indigenous communities to support Albertans' extreme drought conditions. There's no details as to what that looks like in terms of how they're going to work collaboratively and who they're going to collaborate with, but there is a commitment, so it's a leverage point. And then maintaining and strengthening environmental resource stewardship and conservation through proactive engagement with municipalities, NPOs, and Indigenous communities and organizations. There's not a lot of language in any of the budget documents that talk about proactive engagement in much of their commitments. And so this is something to hold on to. The final objective for priority number 1 is building Alberta. And the big piece here is that they're just looking at building Alberta, investing in Alberta's Heritage Fund, Alberta's Heritage by allocating 51 million to support the stewardship of the heritage resources, which, include the Royal Alberta Museum and the Tyrrell Museum. Under priority 2, for supporting a refocused effective healthcare, you'll see a significant chunk of the budget went to health this year. The health and education were our 2 biggest ministries. So there's 4 integrated provincial health agencies that have been or will be established this year. Recovery Alberta is our mental health and addictions pillar. That was operational in September. We've got Primary Care Alberta, which became operational in February of this year. Acute Care Alberta, which will be kind of the hospital emergent type care, and that's supposed to launch in February. I don't believe it did, so they're a little behind schedule on that one. And then Assisted Living Alberta, which will be our continuing care type services, will launch April 1st. You'll notice continuing care, you're probably aware, continuing care has been shifted over to Minister Nixon's office, and so you'll see some budget adjustments when we get to the SCSS ministry to reflect that. Advancing mental health and addictions support. This is a huge theme in this entire budget. Across all of the documents, you will see pieces of mental health and addiction support in the recovery capital model kind of scattered throughout. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end when we talk about trends and projections, but just keep this in mind that this is a giant focus for this government, especially this year. So the Alberta Recovery Model provides access to a full continuum of personalized community-based services and supports, from prevention and intervention to treatment and recovery, giving hope to those currently facing mental health and addiction challenges. That's how they framed it. And that is the lens that you'll have to remember when you're moving forward in some of your objectives over the course of the next several months. Under education and opportunities for skill development, there's been $8.6 billion over the next 3 years allocated to kickstart construction on up to 90 new schools and 24 modernization and replacement projects. They're aiming to create 200,000 new and modernized education spaces. This is in part to accommodate population growth, but also to try and reduce class sizes. Strengthening safe and thriving communities. So they're looking to take action to address crime and social disorder to ensure that all Albertans feel safe and secure in their communities. Albertans also deserve an accessible and sustainable justice system that protects them and supports safer communities. This will be in line with the Recovery Alberta and the Recovery Capital type mandate. Their focused work is on addressing border security, rural crime, hate-motivated crime, firearms violence, and drug trafficking. And then supporting Albertans most in need. We're going to talk a lot about this in some of the ministries that we break down, but just know that this pillar is looking at ensuring supports are in place for our most vulnerable citizens and those who require other targeted protections and support. Alberta is providing targeted affordability supports for vulnerable Albertans and increased funding for specialized agencies that address gender-based violence and human trafficking, as well as supporting low-income seniors and Albertans with disabilities. For lasting and meaningful partnerships with Indigenous communities, they're just looking to continue to partner with Indigenous peoples in pursuit of reconciliation, inclusion, opportunity, and community well-being, including increasing safety for all Indigenous people. It's another theme that you'll see across the entire budget too, is just ensuring that we're addressing social disorder, crime, that sort of rhetoric there. And finally, building better communities. This is support for social services, culture, multiculturalism, recreation, and the arts. We'll break that down in our ministry breakdown. Here's a super high level fiscal outlook. This is not my area of expertise, so I leave this to Zach, but this is kind of the context that we're working within. A tone setting kind of quote that I noticed that I want to share with you all that the minister shared is, the government remains committed to making prudent spending decisions to keep operating expense growth below population growth plus inflation to sustainably deliver important programs and services to Albertans and Alberta businesses. I highlight this because a lot of my conversations with a lot of the nonprofit sector talks about how funding hasn't kept up with population growth and inflation. It's a common battle. We're dealing with increased caseloads, complexity, decreasing funding, et cetera, but it is the government's target to keep funding under those levels. So this is really important for you when you're moving forward in any of your advocacy objectives, that if you're hanging your advocacy on the fact that it hasn't kept up with population growth and inflation, you will get very little traction with the government because they don't want to spend money in line with those two lines. So in terms of kind of the overall fiscal picture, total revenue is estimated at $74 billion, which is $6.6 billion lower than the 2024-25 third quarter forecast of $81 billion. Our operating expenses for 2025-2026 will be about will increase about 3.6%, which is higher than the 2024-2025 forecast and is anticipated to reach $66 billion in 2027 and 2028. Total expense, including operating, capital, and contingency funding, is $79.35 billion. Now, a lot of the increases that we see reflected here are primarily focused on healthcare and education and due mainly to larger than expected population growth. Budget 2025 includes deficits of $5.2 billion, $2.4 billion, and $2 billion over the next 3 years. Our debt has risen to $82.8 billion this year and will increase the next 2 years by about $8 billion per year. Capital plan set to be about $8.64 billion. Contingency fund will increase to $4 billion this year to address economic uncertainty. So this is the tariff conversation. And then unexpected expenses, including the impact of compensation agreements currently under negotiations. So as many of you probably know, right now the province is undergoing the largest public sector contract negotiations that they've ever had to go through. I think it's about 200,000 employees that they're have to set contracts with. And so there's a lot of flux in that, as you can see through some of the strike action that are happening right now. The entire budget is based on an assumption of about 15% tariffs on all goods except energy products, which are assumed to have a 10% tariff. They are projecting that unemployment will stay elevated. So they're assuming a 7.4% rate in 2025, a 7.2% rate in 2026. They say high unemployment is likely to discourage some people from joining the workforce, and this, along with an aging population, will keep the labor force population rate muted at around 69% in 25 and 26. They're also anticipating slowed employment growth, which is forecasted to decelerate from 3.1% last year to 1.9% this year. Growth in primary household income is forecasted to decrease from 7.1% to 4.8%. Population growth is set to decrease from 2.5% in 2025 to 1.4% in 2026 and 2027. and inflation is anticipated to decline from 2.9% to 2.6%. I add these last few points specifically for this group of folks, because when we see increased unemployment, decreased primary household income, still high levels of population growth, inflation challenges, funding cuts, all combined, it means service demand increases. And these are the contextual factors that are going to impact your operations moving forward. The chart there too, because I don't have a lot of information on that in my notes, but it's just the capital plan envelopes. This is not unfamiliar territory for us. We're used to seeing, arts, sports, and recreation is only at 1% of the entire capital spend. Family, social supports, and housing is at 4%. Pretty standard fare for our sector, unfortunately, that we're usually quite low. So these are the 4 areas where the government is focused the budget spend on. I'm going to focus on the highlights that won't be covered in the ministry breakdown, just so we don't miss anything. But things to note, obviously there's a new tax bracket that's been introduced. It's an 8% income tax bracket for the first $60,000 of income, which is estimated to save Albertans about $750 in 2025. They are anticipating about 43,000 units of housing starts in 2025, 41,000 in 2026, and 37,800 by 2028. This is important because if we're already don't have enough housing stock, we're still anticipating population growth, but we're expecting housing starts to drop, means our housing pressures are going to just increase, right? So province is also increasing a number of other fees and licenses for things such as businesses, charities, motor vehicles, and court fees, which means your operating expenses are going to go up a little bit. Education operating expenses are set to increase by 4.5% in 2025-2026 to support projected enrollment growth and other emergent needs. Important to know, education property taxes are increasing this year from $2.56 per $1,000 of assessed value for residential farmland properties, and from $3.76 per 1,000 to $4 per $1,000 for non-residential properties to cover 31.6% of education's operating costs. These numbers are set to continue to rise for the next 2 years until they cover 33.3% of education's operating costs. So I know based on assessed values, Calgary looks like their property tax or their education taxes are set to go up $276 a year. I think I saw Edmonton's is around $90, and it's just based on assessment value of the properties in your local areas. Just keep that in mind because that's going to add extra pressures too. There's been $1.873 billion allocated to drugs and supplemental health benefit programs, which is a decrease from 2024 budget. To decrease even though there was an acknowledgement from the government that there's been an increase in demand. So it's just an interesting juxtaposition that the government, right before stating the budget line, it's like there's been increased demand and population for this program, but we're cutting the budget for it. The largest component of this line is the senior drug program, which is $863 million. There's $135 million allocated to skills and trade program targeting labor shortages, which remains on par. That's the same funding amount that was allocated in 2024, 2025. $9 million in 2025-26 and $17 million over the next 2 years allocated to Alberta's 6 publicly funded independent academic institutions. Then we have an increase in funding for court and justice services and for Crown prosecution services. They're creating a new human trafficking unit, which aims to hold perpetrators accountable, disrupt and dismantle human trafficking enterprises, and hire specialized resources to manage and support the growing volume of prosecutions. There's not a lot of details about the human trafficking unit, but it is clearly a area of focus for this government. The government's also, using their words, collaborating with the Alberta Law Foundation to increase its contribution to Legal Aid Alberta. So with the grant, while the grant to Legal Aid Alberta is decreasing in 2025-2026 by $22 million down to 88 million, current service levels will be maintained as a result. So this is, for those of you who get grants from the Alberta Law Foundation, this decrease in funding of $22 million is going to impact how those grants are allocated. There's also randomly $4 million over the next 3 years allocated for healthcare modernization. No idea what that looks like, but I won't complain if we don't have to carry around this little pieces of paper any longer. So we've got 9 ministries to look through. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to try and speed this up a little bit. For our ministry breakdowns, I've kind of just looked at key outcomes, notable expenditures, and then anything that is of note and consequence to be aware of moving forward. So I've tried to keep this pretty brief, but the key outcomes are the exact same for arts, culture, and status of women as they were in 2024, 2025. Not very creative. Total expense for this year is 226 million, which is a decrease of 25 million from the 2024-25 forecast, and a 35 million decrease from the budgeted allotment for 2024-25. The biggest lines that took the biggest budget cut is the community and voluntary support services, which decreased from 128.88 million to 92.5 million. This is set to decrease even further to 72.9 million in 2026, and it'll increase slightly after that back to 92 million in 2027-2028. It's a pretty substantial cut. It's the only line that got a cut like that. The total operating expense for this ministry is also set, therefore, to decrease to 211.5 million next year because of that cut to that support services line. The AFA is going to see an annual budget increase of $4.5 million each of the next 3 years. So it'll rise to a total of $43 million a year by 2027-2028. And just a random note that I found in one of the documents, the status of women budget line is a bit of an anomaly for 2024-2025 because they transferred $10 million from the Federal National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence to environment and protected areas. I'm not sure why or how those are related, but it was very interesting that that was a note that they made. One of the key objectives for outcome 1 is to promote and support nonprofit organizations, including working with community partners to develop a plan to increase volunteerism across the province. So we'll keep an eye out for engagement opportunities for that. We're not sure what that plan looks like yet, but keep it on your horizon. There's been $8 million allocated to the Alberta Media Fund, 51 million, we already talked about that one, $225,000 allocated to scholarships, which include the Women in STEM, Persons Case, and Women's in the Technical Arts scholarships. Then there's $84.6 million through community grant programs, including CIP and CFEP. So CIP funding was cut by $2 million. CFEP remains unchanged this year, but next year will decrease by $25 million due to the temporary 3-year increase ending. So it's going to put more challenges on our infrastructure costs. Outcome 2, completely unchanged from budget 2024-2025. Notable expenditures include $15.7 million allocated to implement the Alberta's 10-year strategy to end gender-based violence. It's $4.1 million allocated to implement the French Policy Action Plan. And then this one also includes the AFA funding. Children and Family Services have these two outcomes. Outcome 1, focused on services that build on the strengths of the individual, family, and the community to reduce reliance on intensive support in the long term. And they're looking to support family resource networks, young adults transitioning out of care, and affordability efforts. So notable expenditures in this ministry include $81 million allocated to support vulnerable youth transitioning to adulthood who have previous or current child intervention through the Transition to Adulthood program, so the TAP program, and the Advancing Futures program. TAP funding increased by $6 million this year and will increase again by $14 million by 2027-2028 as they're anticipating demand to increase. $67 million has been allocated to family resource networks, which is the exact same amount that was allocated last year. $375 million has been allocated to the Alberta Child and Family Benefit Program, which represents an increase of $29 million from last year. This is in part due to population growth, a 2% escalator, because we have our own Alberta inflation rate now, which is our escalator clause, and increased phased out income thresholds. Notably, one of the key objectives in outcome 1 highlights that the ministry will be reviewing and updating government investment and long-term vision for women's shelters programming for individuals, women, children, and families experiencing family violence and abuse. I know some of you have already been engaged in some of these conversations, but that's something to keep on your radar if you work in that space. For outcome 2, they're focused on preventing domestic and sexual violence, helping families stay together or reunite, and finding placements in kinship care, foster care, and adoptive homes. Notable key objectives here include the development and implementation of workforce strategies to support the child intervention workforce and partnering with community-based organizations to support Albertans experiencing sexual violence and family violence and abuse so they get the support they need, find healing, and live safely in their communities. So key expenditures here is $622 million allocated to improve the child intervention system, which is an increase of $58 million, primarily to support contracted agencies facing recruitment challenges and rising costs. There's $325 million allocated to support foster, kinship care, and permanency placement, increase caregiver rates, and attract new caregivers. This includes $13 million for foster caregivers and to build capacity, as well as $47 million in subsequent 2 years for increasing case complexity. $25 million has been allocated to provide services and supports through funded community-based organizations so Albertans impacted by sexual violence, family violence, and abuse. When I compare that to budget 2024, it appears to be a big cut. The key objective in 2024 that aligns with this was budgeted at $84.6 million. We're still trying to figure out if there's been some program reallocation with the shuffling of portfolios, but if not, that reflects the substantive budget cut. Budget 2025 also includes $19 million over 3 years to support increasing demands and cost of providing services. Immigration and multiculturalism. This ministry, more or less unchanged from last year. Total operating expenses $42 million this year, which is an increase of almost $2 million, mainly due to the introduction of new services and fees for international qualifications assessment services. There's an anticipated decline in the number of immigrants expected as a result of recent federal policy changes, and then an associated decline in expense to process fewer people. Both outcomes are the exact same as last year, except for there's a slight wording change in outcome 2. And the expenses for this ministry are budgeted to remain static for the next 3 years. Indigenous relations, this one's similar to immigration multiculturalism in that it's pretty static, but total expense for this ministry is 238 million for 2025, 2026, which is essentially the same as last year. Expense will remain flat to 2027, 2028. And they're anticipating an increase of about $8 million from to the First Nations Development Fund, so FNDF. They're expecting that fund will increase to a total of 164 million by 2027, 2028. This is dependent upon whether or not they introduce changes to AGLC and the casino funding arrangement. So this is a tentative number, I would say. They've reallocated funding to the Aboriginal Business Investment Fund, so ABIF. There's been $4 million allocated to the Community Support Fund for projects that address violence and increase safety and economic security. And AIOC funding was also renewed for this one. Jobs, economy, and trade. It's a beast of a budget. Their key outcomes reflected there. Total expenses in 2025, 2026 are $2.3 billion, an increase of 366 million from last year. By 2027, 2028, expenses forecasted to decline by 542 million to 1.77 billion, largely due to decreases of about $490 million in childcare. And this is a federal transfer program that they will have to renegotiate. And so the budget is reflecting that hasn't been renegotiated yet. A $26 million reduction in workforce strategy budget line and a $25 million reduction in economic development activities. They have allocated $11 million for the Alberta is Calling Moving Bonus Program, $4 million for occupational health and safety, and then $10 million to the film and television tax credit and $6 million for the coal workforce transition program. The workforce strategies budget line decreased from 10 million from the 2024-2025 forecast, but it was originally budgeted for 2024-2025 at $27 million higher. This budget line will continue to decrease, dropping to 74.7 million in 2026, 2027, and then will increase a little bit in 2027, 2028 to 75.8 million. But when you have multiple ministries commenting that they're going to build new workforce strategies, especially to engage youth 16 to 24, and your workforce strategies budget line continues to decrease, there's a bit of a tension there that will have to be navigated. Outcome one is the exact same as budget 2024. They're just looking to encourage economic growth, support the success of Alberta entrepreneurs and job creators, and support Alberta's economic competitiveness and productivity. Looking to increase trade, support businesses' ability to access new markets and attract job creating investment. The Northern Regional Economic Development Grant Program was renewed. There's $3 million allocated to that program, so that'll be important for some of you folks. Outcome two, also the same as budget 2024. They've added a key objective to this one, though, to revise policy and legislation as necessary to better support workers and employers. And we'll talk about this in a couple slides about in line with trends and projections, but there is a lot of commentary about looking at legislation and being willing to change that if needed. For this outcome, $70 million has been allocated to the skills and training support programs, which is a decrease of 31 million from budget 2024. The rationale behind this is the end of the agreement with the Canada-Alberta Job Grant. We were hoping to see that budget line increase. The government would input additional funding to help offset some of that, but it does not appear that happened. And then $500,000 has been allocated to the Northern Alberta Development Bursary Program. Outcome 3, not a lot of super relevant pieces there for our programs, but for outcome 4, for childcare, this is massive. So the childcare program is budgeted at $1.96 billion this year. Again, this is the final year of the current Canada-Alberta Canada-wide early learning and childcare agreement, which represents an increase of $380 million from last year. We all saw the announcement that with the increased funding and the change in the flat parent fee model that the province has implemented, we're at about $15 a day for children to attend programming. This did result in the removal of the low income subsidy, however, so there are some challenges there to navigate. The government says that they are committed to continuing to fund these even while they undergo negotiations with the federal government. So we'll have to see, obviously, pending federal government election will impact how those negotiations go as well. Notable additional key objective here, support access to out-of-school care programs through income tested subsidy and workforce investment. So we'll have to see what that all looks like. Mental health and addictions. The mandate of this ministry is to support Albertans' overall wellness. It's establishing and enhancing recovery-oriented services across the continuum of care for those at risk of or experiencing mental health and addiction challenges, and provides a comprehensive range of integrated community-based services, including prevention, early intervention, treatment, and recovery. The operating expense for this ministry is $1.7 billion in 2025-2026, will rise again by 79 million to 1.74 billion-ish in and will be at 1.74 billion by 2027-2028. These increases are for implementing compassionate intervention framework, which we'll talk a little bit about in a bit. Recovery Alberta services, 11 new recovery communities that will be operational by 2027, and to expand mental health classrooms from 20 to 60 for clinical supports to students with complex mental health needs. Compassionate Intervention Act will be introduced this spring. It's going to be massive, it's going to be contentious, and there will be legally challenged. We already know this. The intent is to create a framework for someone who is likely to cause harm to themselves or others because of their problematic substance use or addiction to be given a mandated addiction treatment order, thus protecting their life and the lives of us and safety of others. This will require more recovery and secure treatment capacity. So they're expecting 2 new specialized addiction and mental health facilities will be built, one in Edmonton, one in Calgary, to support Albertans struggling with the most severe cases of addiction. All of the outcomes talk about working with other ministries to align ministry mandates across the board with Recovery Alberta and the Alberta recovery model. And so this is paramount to how we are going to function in the next little bit when you're aligning messaging, when you're aligning your kind of advocacy objectives, is how you're going to align what you're asking for primarily with recovery capital, addressing social disorder, and keeping and building community resiliency. I'm going to go into a lot of more detail about that because we're running out of time. Public safety, threw this one in because there's some weird relevant programs in this one, but it's responsible for keeping Alberta communities safe and secure and assist with disaster and emergency preparations. Most of these objectives are the same as budget 2024, but like they're still talking about refocusing policing efforts, they're implementing strategies to improve the delivery of policing, but they're also looking at supporting addressing the root cause of crime through investment in person-centered approaches to policing, combating human trafficking, youth crime prevention and diversion programs, correctional services, including the implementation of a recovery-oriented system of care that provides a network of community-based services. So again, all through the lens of Recovery Alberta. They're also looking at continuing to implement the new victims services model. So they've allocated funding to that. And then disaster recovery. It's disaster recovery. There has been a $1.7 million increase to search and rescue operations. So for those of you who volunteer with those organizations. Seniors, community social services. But this ministry is gigantic. It holds so much now that it is very stretched. So this supports the safety and well-being of seniors, people with disabilities, and they're vulnerable facing homelessness or in need of temporary help. This includes career and employment programs, supports for people with disabilities, income support, affordable housing, public guardian and trustee services, homelessness support, and continuing care, which was just transferred over. So this budget, when you look at the budget numbers themselves, are boosted by an additional short-term funding for possible needs arising from potential US tariffs. So keep this in mind, because just because the budget lines are increased doesn't mean that they necessarily will spend them. It's contingent upon how the tariff war plays out. We don't know what that looks like though, so it's kind of it's a little deceptive in some ways that it's hard to discern how much that's going to go through. So notably, employment and income support is estimated about 1.25 billion this year, which is an increase of about 258 million. That will increase again. And then you'll see AISH funding, so assured income for the severely handicapped, that decreased by 49 million this year due to differences in anticipated program delivery costs, which more than offset increasing pressures from caseload growth and the annual rate escalation. They say overall client income will be unaffected by this. There's some debate about this funding cut and how that's going to impact, but just keep that in mind. There is the new Alberta Disability Assistance Program that is set to launch in 2026. So there's been some funding allocated to that to help get that operational. That program is meant to better empower those with a disability to work without having significant reductions applied to income assistance or medical benefits. Then Assisted Living Alberta now falls under Minister Nixon's ministry as well. So this is focusing on making the full continuum of care from assisted living, home care, and community care to housing and social supports with wraparound services in line with Recovery Alberta, Alberta Recovery Model, sorry. PDD and FSCD both saw increases in funding. So there's a $73 million increase to PDD, and FSCD saw an expense increase by $9 million. That is good news. Support to lower income seniors through the seniors benefit is also increasing by 33 million this year. Again, primarily due to senior population growth and annual rate escalation. The AHPP Affordable Housing Program saw an increase in funding of $250 million this year. The Seniors Lodge Modernization Program saw an additional $50 million allocated to that program, so that's at $150 million now. The housing strategy saw an increase in funding of 21 million to 113 million. The IHCP programs, the Indigenous Housing Capital Program, saw an additional $25 million added to that funding, so it grew to $92 million. And then FCSS funding, unfortunately, stayed static at $105 million this year. There's a commitment to implement a provincial housing-focused and recovery-oriented delivery model to support people experiencing homelessness to access the services they need. So I'm scrolling through to find what's important to tell you because I'm running out of time. Now I'm like, what's most important? skip the rest of this. Tourism and sport. Both outcomes exact same as budget 2024. Total expense in this budget is 133 million for this year, which is $3 million lower than last year. It's set to decrease another 12 million to 121 by 2027, 2028. Capital grants increased by $5 million in 2025, 26, but then drop back to 10 million per year. Then they're going to continue to implement the higher ground tourism strategy and implement the All Season Resorts Act, which we saw introduced last year. There's $75.2 million allocated to Travel Alberta, which is a decrease of about 4.3 million from last year. Then funding for the Active Communities Initiative remains static at $10 million, and that's to support the development of small and mid-sized sport and recreation facilities through the province. And then there's $2.5 million allocated to support major sport events such as national and international championships. There's also, for this one, a commitment to implement the Fairness and Safety in Sport Act to increase safety for women and girls in sport by ensuring female athletes have the opportunity to compete in biological female-only divisions. So we'll see some more of this play out over the course of the next few months. Trends and projections. All right, significant realignment efforts underway. Huge amount of commitment across all ministries, wherein they're doing a more formal program review process with the intent to identify an array of initiatives for savings or refocusing of resources on core priorities. They state that this will continue in 2025, 26, and beyond, to embed an approach to fiscal planning that is constantly questioning how programs are delivered and whether outcomes are achieved. This is huge. You're going to see potential changes in grant funding, reporting requirements. You're going to see a change in which programs are funded, as we're already seeing this. We have no idea how extensive this is going to be moving down the road. SCSS is looking to improve processes to measure and report on the income support program by implementing a refreshed logic model with new performance measures and implementing new processes to monitor and report on performance measures and outcomes. So like you can see this theme coming through a bunch of the programs. They're looking at realigning post-secondary programs and employment programs to align with provincial priorities. There is the potential for the establishment of provincial oversight for combative sport events, which was just announced at 11:30 this morning, with the province obtaining sole authority to sanction such events. There's still some question as to what role the province is going to take in regulating combative sport, but we could potentially see some of those changes coming down the pipes. There's been a vocal, acknowledged shift in funding priorities away from funding prevention efforts to funding intervention efforts, and a shift in philosophy in that the GOA is looking at funding the individual, not an organization. Those were their words, which is partially why the part of the rationale they used to defund some of those disability advocate organizations is that they want the funding to go to the person. We know that this is going to be a contentious legislative session. We saw Bill 38 was tabled right before the budget, which impacted the Child and Youth Advocate Act, the Charitable Fundraising Act, Residential Tenancy Act, a whole slew of other things, but the Child and Youth Advocate Act and the Charitable Fundraising Act are the ones that most impact you folks. Substantial changes in there. PIPET changes are coming. We don't know what those look like, but we have been told it impacts the sector. In part, they need it to be tabled to help support compassionate intervention legislation. We don't know what else it will include. And we also know that the compassionate intervention framework will be implemented this spring. So a lot on the docket for the next 2-ish months for session. that we'll be keeping tabs on, but these will impact your operations moving forward. I'm gonna leave it there because we have like 8 minutes and I want to leave room for questions, but it's a lot and I'm sorry for that. But if you have questions, I will see if I can answer what I can. Yes, we could share the PowerPoint with you for sure. This is also being like recorded and will be available on our website as well. No other questions? Yeah. Yeah, let's say, Cody, can we just unmute?
Hi, Aileen. Nice to see you. Hello, everyone from across the province. I have a question about advocacy. I have been advised by various different folks in government and outside to be very cautious about the use of advocacy. And so I'm wondering, Elaine, if you've heard similar recommendations. And I think that's kind of getting to that statement that you just had at the very end there about funding to the individual versus organization. And just thought if you had any comment.
Yeah, so a lot of our efforts right now, depending on how you're advocating and what you're advocating for, we're really trying to pull in a collaborative, collective approach to advocacy. And so pulling multiple organizations who will be impacted by the same thing to kind of amplify the voice also mitigates risk in that regard. There are ways to talk to government and bring forward solutions that don't seem adversarial, but you have to tread carefully. There is absolutely risk involved. But now more than ever, I would argue that folks like we need the nonprofit sector to be talking to government now more than ever. And so finding allies to and cross sector and outside of sector allies to help bolster that message helps protect you but still amplify what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
Hi, thanks. Really informative and appreciate your time, Eileen. Can you just talk a little bit more about this move from prevention in favor of intervention? Like so much of us do prevention and early intervention, and so when I think of intervention, I think of like all those mandated services under children's services, right? What might that look like, do you think, from community-based organizations that aren't doing child intervention, but they're more in favor of intervention, like from a community-based organization, what that might look like? Any thoughts?
I think we're still learning the impacts of what this is going to look like. I know we saw the one organization, I believe was in Grand Prairie, who had I think their budget was $54,000 or something, was cut, and the ministry's rationale behind that was because they don't want to they want to focus on the intervention, not prevention. And so I think in terms of organizations who operate in that space, you're going to want to be careful with how you're framing your services and if there's ways to kind of align language to support both intervention and prevention, that would serve you well.
Great, thank you for that.
The question in the chat about government focus on nonprofits that assist ACB seniors. seniors are a soft spot for this government. And so I think the nonprofits that continue to support seniors are have a little bit more protection in some ways in that regard because seniors vote, right? And so we see increased funding for some of these line items for the next 3 years. And so I think in terms of that, you're a little more insulated. Hopefully that answers your question. Let's see, can you speak more on the trade sector and how the budget may impact jobs? Tariffs are gonna play a big part on how the trade sector is going to be impacted this year, and so right now, everything's purely speculation. They are looking to increase trade spaces in some of the schools, like the post-secondary institutions, to increase increase class participation and that kind of thing. There's a huge focus on trying to make it so trades are seen as a viable career path for those in high school too, and so there's a focus for that as well. So I think like trades are this government's favorite type of post-secondary programming, right? And so I think we'll continue to see investment in that. And honestly, tariffs will probably force additional investment into that kind of thing because we're going to need to support that sector. Thoughts on how okay, so there's a question in the chat about thoughts on how the move from prevention to intervention will affect FCSS funding. We're really fortunate that the Premier loves FCSS. When she was running, she wanted to increase FCSS funding, and obviously we had not seen that happen, but she is a huge advocate for the FCSS program. So I don't think we have to worry about that being cut. It would take legislative changes to impact the FCSS mandate, but I have no indication that that is happening right now, again, because the Premier loves it. So I think we are probably pretty safe there for now, which is good. And then, sorry, just trying to go through all the questions here. With the drop in infrastructure support through CFEP, this will have, significant impact in rural. There seems to be a lack of focus on rural in general. Would that be a correct assessment? You are not alone in that assessment, Tim. I don't know if you all saw MLA Scott Sinclair's response to the budget as well, and how it seemed from his perspective that it also generally lacked investment in the rural areas. I would agree. There, for a party who has a large vote base in rural municipalities, I was shocked to see the lack of investment across the rural communities, and the amount of investment that was focused on big city centers, especially because the election's still a couple years out, right? If we were having this conversation next year, I would be less surprised by that because they'd be gearing up for the election. Infrastructure challenges, especially in the sector, and are going to just continue to amplify. And there seems to be a lack of willingness to have that conversation. And I understand that like infrastructure deficits across the board right now exist in this province, but particularly the sector seems to get the short end of the stick in terms of infrastructure funding. And shoot me an email and we'll discuss that offline for sure. Okay, I'm cognizant of everybody's time. It's 1:02. If there's no, I'm happy to stay and take a couple more questions, but if everybody needs to go, feel free. Really appreciate everybody's time. Thank you very much. We will share the recording and the PowerPoint with you sometime later today, hopefully, or tomorrow. But otherwise, if you have, oh, I didn't put my contact information up. If you had questions or concerns, feel free to message me. We'll put my email here so that way you have access to it. Put it in the chat. But I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you for your service and have a great rest of your week.